autobiography, assembling narrative elements of prose and poetry within tight constraints of a rigid literary structure. Such works were brief, and the format lent itself to the creation of collective biographies. In Tibetan, these are called golden rosaries, in which each short biography, each individual was understood as like a golden bead in a rosary that documented a lineage from the founder all the way up to the current writer. So in many cases, such works advanced the sectarian agenda of legitimizing a master by documenting his and less often her unbroken link to an authentic source of the Buddhist teachings. Then beginning perhaps in the early 13th century, a new form of life writing emerged that began to model this body. That is the biographical compendium. And these were comprehensive, autonomous works, often hundreds of pages long, that served as encyclopedic repositories of biographical minutiae. And for the first time, they began to anthologize the Yogin's poetry within extensive networks of song cycles, of cycles of songs, collections of poetry. And this brings us to the canonical version completed by the Madman in 1488, 3 years after Mallory's publication of the Lord of Yogins. Much could be said by way of literary analysis of the Life of Milarepa, and indeed I have an entire chapter doing just that. But here I want to emphasize just a few points. So the Madman was the first author to divide and separate the life story from the poetry anthology and create two autonomous works. So this is the life story for the first time, could be read in one continuous narrative arc from his birth to his eventual realization and death. But he also transformed what had originally been a third-person narrative into a first-person exposition. And I'll have more to say about this in a few moments. But the Madman was also a skillful literary stylist who fashioned his account with richer thematic development and greater sophistication in plotting and pacing than had previously been seen. And I'm reminded here of Natalie Z. Davis's useful notion of fictionalizing the story. So fictional here referring not to the story's falsity, but to its forming and shaping and molding elements, that is, to the actual crafting of narrative. So the Madman drew upon what became a vast archive of biographical documents, of early biographical documents, to craft a story that was at once captivating and poignant. In essence, he told a really good story. But I want to turn now to representations of the Madman and Sanya Haruka as author, and to his role as the literary and perhaps as the literal voice of the Yogin's biographical tradition. So now fixing a lifelike model. So the late 15th century was a defining moment for Milarepa's life, even though he had been dead for almost 400 years. It was a period of both civil unrest and religious expansion in central Tibet, where Sanya Haruka, who was born in 1452, entered a world consumed by religious and sectarian conflict. He also appeared during a period that has been characterized as an age of fervent religious reform and doctrinal systematizing. He later formed part of a tradition of unconventional, transgressive figures known as religious madmen. And he thereby advocated a movement, however symbolic, away from the rising tide of corporate religion back to the solitary itinerant yogin, an ideal upon which Milarepa's own religious tradition had been founded. Sanya Haruka was ordained as a monk at a young age, but at 21 he gave away his robes and possessions, and following Milarepa's example, he spent years in solitary retreat in the mountain wildernesses and jungle of southern Tibet. He's described as having quickly achieved the power of inner yogic heat, called tuma, which is marked by the ability to wear nothing but a simple cotton robe, even in the frigid winter snow. And it was during this period of intense contemplative practice that he adopted the lifestyle of a mad yogin, for which he became famous. And there's one passage from his own, from the Madman's biography, that describes him in this way, and I'm quoting from the text here. Upon his naked body, he rubbed human ashes, daubs of blood, and smears of grease. He wore a necklace of intestines from a human corpse and made ornaments of its hands and feet. He cut off the fingers and toes. He tied them together with thread and bound them into his hair. And thus, although the people of southern Tibet were themselves unclean and extremely rough. His power overwhelmed them, and his compassion brought them under his control, so that he became extremely devoted. So the image of these kinds of antinomian figures originates in the adepts, or so-called siddhas, of medieval Indian Buddhism from the 7th to 11th centuries. Such figures were famous for their transgressive behavior, especially in the practice of tantra, but they gained a tremendous status even at the margins of society as holders of powerful transmission lines of Buddhism. So the madman spent much of his life literally following Milarepa's footsteps, wandering among his mountain retreats, and meditating in his caves. Sangye Haruka later carried out several major literary projects, but it's in his it is the record of his work on the life of Milarepa that receives the place of prominence in all of his own biography. In 1488, Sangye's composition was complete, and he had targeted, by his own admission, he had targeted an audience far broader than had previously existed for similar narratives. And he imagined his works as circulating as an independent literary tradition, reaching political elites, religious virtuosi, and ordinary individuals alike. The author, the madman, was plagued by political distractions and financial hardship. At one point, he faced bibliographic mutiny when his followers were forced to contribute not only physical labor, but also their own material capital. But with patronage from the royal courts of southern Tibet, he was able to produce, for the first time, xylographic prints, that is, prints made from wood blocks, of the life of Milarepa. And in doing so, the madman was riding a growing wave of technological innovation as woodblock printing was adopted into mainstream use in central Tibet only within about a half century earlier. The madman proved himself equally shrewd in the story's promotion and distribution, joining his new texts with related visual, ritual, and liturgical materials, commencing what may have been one of Tibet's first concerted multimedia approaches to life writing. The legacy of his efforts is witnessed perhaps most clearly in the printing history of his version of the Life of Milarepa, where following his original edition, the madman's own disciples produced new woodblock prints in rapid succession at local ateliers throughout southern Tibet in 1538, 1540, and 1550. So, and creating new woodblock prints was really extensive and quite an expensive undertaking. New editions subsequently appeared across the Tibetan Buddhist world at printing houses both large and small, and altogether we know of at least 19 separate woodblock print editions, making this, I suspect, one of the most widely reprinted biographical works in Tibet's largely bibliophilic history. When Sangye Haruka concluded the biography, he affixed neither his ordination name nor the epithet the Madman of Western Tibet. The region is known as Tsang, so he's known as the Madman of Tsang, or Tsang Nyun. This led to some confusion on the part of early European scholars who referred to the life story either as an autobiography written by the Madman, written by Milarepa's own hand, or dictated by him and recorded by a disciple scribe as an eyewitness account, because there was no discernible sort of author's name in the text. And it was not until the first English translation of Milarepa's collected poetry, published in 1962, that the author was first correctly identified. Now, the confusion over who authored the Life of Milarepa, which is largely a problem among non-Tibetan commentators, was perhaps understandable. Although the life story is clearly titled a biography, as opposed to an autobiography, it takes the structural form of an autobiography narrated in the first person. The Madman switch to a first-person narrative made for compelling literature, but it also invested the text with a sheen of authenticity, as if capturing the life of the subject himself in his own words. And this was really an unprecedented move within Milarepa's biographical tradition, and perhaps in Tibetan literature more broadly. Yet the correspondence of author and subject lies deeper still. The first-person narrative here was not merely a literary conceit, but rather underscored a direct relationship between the Yogin and the Madman, first prompted by the author himself, and later promoted by his followers. followers